That's the deal, I said. That's what the clean room costs. You don't get to decide against me. You only get to decide. I hate it, she said, with great affection. I know, I said.
Decide anyway.
My Playful Wife, Episode 42, The Bigger Room, written by Mia. We spent the fortnight doing the only honest thing there is to do with a decision this size, which is to refuse to decide it quickly and to map it instead fully in both directions until we could see the actual shape of the thing rather than the dazzle of it. We did this at the kitchen table. Over several nights, the envelope open now between us, the number out in the air where it could be looked at. And we made 2 lists, though we did not call them lists. We are not list people. We simply talked, across the wormwood, in the lamplight, one night the gain and another night the cost, until both of them stood fully built in the room and could be walked around and seen from every side. I want to set down both honestly, because the temptation of a story like ours is to put a thumb on it, to make the small true thing nobly triumphant and the big thing hollow, and the truth was not that clean. The truth had real weight on both sides of it, which is exactly why it took a fortnight and not an evening. I have come to believe that the length of time a decision honestly requires is a fairly reliable measure of its weight, and that one of the quiet errors of a hurried life is the habit of deciding large things at the speed of small ones. But some decisions are large enough that deciding them fast is not strength at all. It is a refusal to feel their actual size, a way of getting out from under the weight of them by pretending the weight is not there. A fortnight was not indecision. A fortnight was respect, the respect a thing this large is owed by anyone honest enough to truly hold it. The gain was enormous, and I made myself say so, out loud, fully, without the protective irony that lets a person diminish a thing they're afraid of wanting. Reach, her work, which perhaps 400 people had ever touched on the bodies of thousands, in cities she would never visit, carried into ordinary lives all over the country and beyond it. More weepers. That was how I put it to her, and her face moved when I did, because we both knew what it meant. The woman in Ahmedabad who had wept at the Rose Dark was one stranger, found by one dress, by the grace of a tiny operation that could reach almost no one. Scale meant more of them. Hundreds, maybe, over the years. Hundreds of strangers undone by the things Saloni does, each of them met by a cloth that turned out to be secretly about them. That is not a small good. That is, arguably, the whole point of making anything, to reach the stranger it was secretly for. And the small operation reaches so few. Money, real money, the kind that ends a particular fear I had watched live in my wife's shoulders for 15 years, the freelance maker's fear. The every collection might be the last arithmetic, the quiet dread under even the good years. The offer ended that, permanently. It bought a floor under us neither of us had ever stood on. I would be lying if I said that floor did not call to me. The husband who had watched her carry that fear so long. There is a deep, almost physical relief in the thought of a beloved person never being afraid about money again. Legacy. The word is grand and I distrust it, but it was real here. A name that outlasts the hands, a house that goes on making after the maker is gone. The difference between a body of beautiful work that ends when she puts down the scissors and an institution that carries her vision forward for 50 years. And validation, the plainest and most human of the gains. The world, the actual moneyed, serious world, looking at the thing she does alone in a small room and saying we want it, by the 1,000, we will bet a fortune on it. After 20 years of being a well-kept secret, someone had arrived to tell her the secret deserved to be famous. No one is above wanting to hear that. I am certainly not, and neither is she, and we did not pretend otherwise. So the gain was real. I want that on the record. We were not choosing between a good thing and an obviously empty one. We were choosing, as people almost always are at the real crossroads, between two genuine goods, which is the only kind of choice that is actually hard. The easy choices, the ones we congratulate ourselves on, are almost never really choices at all. They are recognitions of a thing already obvious, good over bad, and they cost nothing because nothing real was surrendered. You do not agonize over whether to take the better paid, kinder, nearer job over the worse one. You simply take it and call the taking a decision, though no actual deciding occurred. The only choices that deserve a name are the ones where you must give up a genuine good to gain another genuine good, where every yes is also a real and grievable no, and where no amount of cleverness can spare you the loss, because the loss is built into the very structure of the choosing. And then, the other night, the cost, when we built it fully in the room, turned out to be made of a single thing, and that single thing was her hands. Because here is what the bias cut had already taught us both. The things Saloni knew in her body long before the offer came, and I had only recently learned to see, that the truth of her work lives in her hands. Not in the designs, which could be drawn by anyone. Not in the colors, which could be matched, but in the hands, the literacy of the fingertips, the finding of the living diagonal by touch, the 1,000 micro-adjustments, no two of which repeat, the woman at 2 in the morning feeling for the true of the grain and committing. That is the thing that makes a Saloni piece, and not a competent imitation of one. And that thing does not scale. It physically cannot. You cannot hand-cut 10,000 garments on the bias. There are not enough hours or enough hands. The very first thing that happens when you scale a handmade thing is that the hand comes off it. The cutting goes to a pattern and a machine and other people's fingers. The maker stops making and starts managing the making. Her name goes onto 10,000 garments her hands never touch, and the thing that was true about the 12 gets averaged, diluted, systematized, and quietly, bloodlessly killed, not by any villain, just by the arithmetic of volume, which has no malice in it and no mercy either. This is the part that makes scaling so hard to argue against and so easy to drift into. There is no villain in it. No one decides to kill the true thing. Every individual step is sensible, even admirable. Hire good people, build good systems, meet the demand, serve the customer, grow responsibly. Each step, taken alone, is unobjectionable, and the sum of all the unobjectionable steps is the quiet disappearance of the one thing that made the work worth scaling in the first place. The truth does not die in scaling by anyone's intention. It dies by 1,000 reasonable decisions, each of which was right, and the wrongness of which is visible only in the whole, long after the whole has hardened past changing. "I would never cut again," she said, the night we built the cost, and she said it not as a complaint but as a fact she was turning over, testing the weight of. "Not really. Not the way I cut now."
Idea prova cuts.
I direct. I build the thing that makes the thing. And maybe that's growing up. Maybe that's what every maker who matters eventually has to become, the one who builds the house instead of the one who stitches in it. She looked at her own hands on the worn table, the chalk permanently in the creases of them. But these would go quiet. And I don't know who I am with quiet hands. I have never once, in 20 years, been a person with quiet hands. That was when I understood the title the situation had quietly given itself, the phrase that had been sitting under the whole fortnight, the bigger room. Because that is literally what the offer was, among other things, a bigger room. The flagship, the proper studio, the real premises, the operation that needs space. We had stood on the day of the meeting, in a corner of their offices and been shown on a screen, the kind of room her label could have, vast and white and full of light, 20 assistants, a room you could lose the current workroom inside 10 times over. A bigger room. and it was beautiful, and any maker would want it, and I watched Saloni want it. But I had learned something about rooms that year, learning to stay awake in our small flat. I had learned that the intimacy of a space is not a function of its size, and more than that, that intimacy is often a function of smallness, that there are kinds of closeness that only happen in a room small enough to hold them, and that do not survive the move to somewhere grander. The true thing in Saloni's work had been made, all these years, in a room where 4 people could see the cloth, where she could stand at one table and reach everything, where the whole of a making was held in a space small enough for one woman's hands to fill. You can move into a bigger room, but the close thing, the thing that was true precisely because it was small and held and entirely hers, does not come with you. You fill the bigger room differently. You fill it with people and process and scale, all of which are real and some of which are good, but you do not fill it the way you filled the small one, with the whole undivided attention of a single pair of hands, because the bigger room is, by its nature, too big for that. The cost of the bigger room is the thing the small room was for. I think a great many people learn this too late, and in domains far beyond cloth, spending years working toward the bigger house, the bigger title, the bigger life, certain the bigness is the prize, and then arriving in the bigger room at last to find it strangely cold, unable to understand why the thing they worked so hard for feels so much emptier than the cramped striving years that got them there. It is because the closeness was in the smallness, and they traded the closeness for the size without ever being told that was the trade. No one tells you the bigger room is colder. We did not resolve it that fortnight. I said I would not flatten the difficulty, and I will not. But something shifted across those nights of building the gain and the cost fully in a room, and the shift was this, that the choice came clear even though the decision did not. By which I mean, at the start of the fortnight it had looked like a choice between a good thing and a better thing, between staying small out of fear and growing big out of courage, and in that framing the answer is obvious, and the only question is whether you are brave enough to take the obvious answer. But by the end of the fortnight, the framing had changed. It was not a choice between small and safe and big and brave. It was a choice between 2 entirely different things a life can be for. One life reaches thousands a little, with a thing that has been averaged enough to scale. The other reaches dozens completely, with a thing that is wholly true, because a single pair of hands made every inch of it. Neither is cowardice. Neither is the obvious answer. They are simply 2 different bets about what a making is for, whether the point is the reach or the truth, the many touched lightly or the few touched all the way down, and a person has to decide which bet is theirs, and there is no universal right answer, only the answer that goes quiet in your particular hands. Which one goes quiet? I asked her, on the last night of the fortnight, the envelope between us, the lamplight low, not pushing, just asking the question she had taught me. That's the thing, she said, slowly, looking at her chalk-creased hands. I keep listening for it, and I can't tell yet. Both of them are still talking. The big one is talking the loudest, obviously, it's an empire, of course it's talking the loudest. But the small one is talking too, and I don't fully trust it either, because some of what the small one is saying might just be fear dressed up as integrity, the comfortable thing pretending to be the true thing. She looked up at me. I don't want to refuse an empire, because I was too frightened to try. That would be its own kind of settling. The indigo in reverse. Refusing the true thing because it was big and scary and called for more of me than I was sure I had. And I understood that she had just named the real trap, the one underneath both the obvious traps, that you can settle by taking the good big thing and losing the truth. Yes, but you can also settle by refusing the big thing out of fear and calling your fear by the flattering name of integrity, and that telling those 2 apart, the genuine true no from the cowardly frightened no, is the hardest discernment there is, and that she did not yet know which of hers it would be. And I could not know it for her, which was the whole agony, and the whole point. From the outside, the true no and the frightened no look identical. They produce the same word, the same declined empire, the same return to the small room. Only the person choosing can feel the difference between them, and even she can mistake one for the other. There was no test I could apply from my chair at the edge that would settle it for her. She had to go down into herself and feel, in the dark, which of the two refusals was actually hers, and I could only sit beside her while she did, and trust that the woman who could tell a true color from a good one could, in time, tell a true life from a good one too. There was a moment late when the lists were built and the talking was done for the night, and we just sat, the two of us, in the lamplight, with the enormous undecided thing on the table between us, and she reached across and put her hand over mine, the chalk-creased maker's hand, and said the thing that mattered more than the decision. "Whatever I choose," she said, "I need you to know I'm not choosing it because of you. Not the small one to keep our life cozy, not the big one to be impressive for you. I watched you all fortnight keep your thumb off it. I know what that cost you, both directions. I know you're frightened of what an empire might do to us, and I know you're frightened of me being afraid about money forever, and I watched you hold both of those down so they wouldn't get into my scale. I see it. I just want you to know I see it." Her hand tightened on mine. "You gave me a clean room to decide in. That's the most loving thing you've ever done, and it's almost unbearable, because now I have to actually decide, with no one to blame and nothing to push against but the truth." "That's the deal," I said. "That's what the clean room costs. You don't get to decide against me. You only get to decide." "I hate it," she said, with great affection. "I know," I said.
Decide anyway.
I wrote it in the 5th notebook that night, the envelope still open and undecided in the next room. The bigger room. Spent the fortnight building both lists fully. Refused to flatten it. The gain is real and enormous. Reach. More weepers. Hundreds of strangers undone instead of one. Money. Ends the 15-year freelance fear. Legacy. Validation. The serious world saying, "We want it by the 1,000. Two genuine goods, not a good versus an empty thing, the only kind of choice that's actually hard. The cost is made of one thing, her hands. The truth of her work lives in her hands, the bias found by touch, the 2 a.m. committing, and that does not scale. The first thing that happens when you scale a handmade thing is the hand comes off it. She'd approve cuts, direct, build the house instead of stitching it. These hands would go quiet, and I don't know who I am with quiet hands." The title. The offer is literally a bigger room, the flagship, the vast white studio. But intimacy is often a function of smallness. The close thing that was true because it was small and held and wholly hers does not survive the move. The cost of the bigger room is the thing the small room was for. Not resolved, but the choice came clear even though the decision didn't. Not small safe versus big brave, but two different things a life can be for. Reach thousands a little with a thing averaged enough to scale, or reach dozens completely with a thing wholly true. The many touched lightly, or the few touched all the way down. No universal right answer. Only the one that goes quiet in your hands. She can't tell yet which goes quiet. Both are still talking. And she named the deeper trap. You can settle by taking the big thing and losing the truth, or settle by refusing the big thing out of fear and calling the fear integrity. The indigo in reverse. Refusing the true thing because it was big and scary and called for more of me than I was sure I had. Kate P. Safe beat, her hand over mine. "Whatever I choose, I'm not choosing it because of you. I watched you keep your thumb off at both directions all fortnight. You gave me a clean room to decide in, and it's almost unbearable because now I have to actually decide, Nothing to push against but the truth. / that's what the clean room costs. / I hate it. / decide anyway. To be continued in episode 43, The One Who Sold.
Simbolo di copyright Mia.
All rights reserved. That was episode 42 of My Playful Wife. If this story is staying with you, the next episode is already waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The complete book is on Amazon, and early episodes plus bonus chapters are on my Patreon. Links are in the description.
I'm Mia.
Thank you for listening.